Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. Today, I'm going to show you how to do the provisional tubular cast on as I start one of my best worsted socks from the top down. The provisional tubular cast on works well for patterns that start with basic 1x1 or knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. And it can be used for pieces knit flat in rows or in the round. The cast on creates an edge that looks like the ribbed stitching comes up to the edge on one side and then rolls continuously over to the other side. The provisional tubular cast on has a very stretchy edge, but it can flare out a little bit depending on your tension. To do the cast on, you're going to need a piece of thin waste yarn and a knitting needle that's slightly smaller than what you'll be using to knit your project. I'm going to be knitting my socks on US size 6 4mm needles. So I'm actually going to cast on with a US size 4 3.5mm needle. Let's get started. The provisional tubular cast on starts exactly like a regular provisional cast on. So you make a slip knot with both your waste yarn and your working yarn. And the yarn tail should just be long enough to weave in later. And you'll notice here that I did not cut a piece off of my waste yarn. I just left it attached to the ball. That's because later on, I'm going to be able to completely remove that waste yarn undamaged, and there's no need to waste my waste yarn. Next, place the right hand needle through the slip knot and then tighten things up. And this slip knot is not going to count as a cast on stitch. We're only using it to temporarily hold the yarn in place and we'll completely remove it later on. Now position the yarns in the slingshot position. So the working yarn gets woven over, under the fingers on your left hand. Bring your fingers forward around the waste yarn. Hold that waste yarn in place. And then the thumb goes in between the working yarn and the waste yarn. And then rotate your thumb back. And now you're set up in the slingshot position. To start casting on stitches, the needle comes forward, underneath the waste yarn, over the working yarn, and then pull that working yarn forward, under the waste yarn, and you've cast on your first stitch. Next is a yarn over. So the working yarn comes forward and over the needle. And you've cast on 2 stitches. I like to hold this yarn over in place just because it's not anchored to anything as I continue casting on. So my knitting needle comes forward, underneath the waste yarn, over the working yarn. Bring that working yarn forward and under the waste yarn, and then yarn over. The knitting needle comes forward, under the waste yarn, over the working yarn, pull the working yarn forward and under the waste yarn, and then yarn over. And you continue casting on in this manner until you have the correct number of stitches. It doesn't matter whether you're planning to knit your ribbing flat in rows or in the round. The first row of stitches is going to be identical for both. This last cast on stitch is like a yarn over. So right now it's not anchored to anything. It's just hanging here loose. So you need to hold it in place with your index finger as you turn your work to start knitting. So I am going to turn my needle the other direction, holding this yarn over in place the whole time. And I'm also going to switch sides here with my yarns since I'm going to start knitting. So let's get those out of the way. The first row of stitches is going to be worked in 2 parts. It's like we're mentally dividing alternating stitches onto two needles so that the knit stitches would be held on the front needle and the purl stitches would be held out of the way at the back. But we're not going to fuss with physically dividing the stitches. It's a lot easier than it actually sounds. We start by knitting every other stitch, and we're going to use our larger knitting needle. Since this first stitch isn't anchored yet, what we need to do so that we can knit that first stitch is just bring our waste yarn forward and around that stitch to hold it in place, and just pinch the waste yarn and hold it as you're forming that first stitch. So the first stitch is knit. And now you can see it's anchored a little bit better. And it's a little bit fidgety here as you're getting started. Bring your working yarn forward between the two needles and then slip that next stitch that would be a purl in your ribbing. The yarn goes back and then knit a stitch. The yarn comes forward between your needles and slip a stitch. And the yarn goes back. Knit, yarn forward, slip, yarn back. Knit, yarn forward, slip, yarn back. And knit across in this manner all the way to the end of the row. When you get to the end of the row, you'll reach that slip knot after slipping your last stitch. That slip knot can just come off the left needle. That's that smaller needle, and we're not going to use it again. And then, if you like, you can undo the slip knot. Just be aware that at this point, that last stitch really is not anchored to anything. Turn it here so you can see a little bit better. It's not anchored, and your working yarn really isn't anchored. So as you turn your needle to go back the other direction, again, you just need to hold things in place here so they don't slip away from you. So I'm going to hold it in place and rotate. You can see a little bit better here how that first stitch is not anchored yet. So I'm just going to pinch it with my fingers. Move my waste yarn out of the way. And now to finish the first row, we're going to go back again. And again, we're going to knit every other stitch. So since this first stitch is not anchored, we're just going to pinch the yarn tails with our finger and then continue again with the larger needle from this point on. Knit the first stitch, drop it off. You still might want to pinch the tails for just a second more. The working yarn comes forward between your two needles and then slip the next stitch and yarn back. And now you should be anchored fine here on the end. You don't have to worry about holding the tails anymore. So just like before, we're going to alternate and we'll knit a stitch, bring the yarn forward, and then slip a stitch, and the yarn goes back. Knit, yarn forward, slip, yarn back. If you're going to be working flat, back and forth in rows, you would just continue across all the way until you get to the end. Since I'm going to be working in the round, I'm at the halfway point, and now I'm going to set things up and start knitting on a third flexible DPN here so that I'm set up to continue working the round when I get to the. So I'll grab my third needle and just continue on in the same manner where I'm going to knit a stitch, bring the yarn forward, slip, yarn back, all the way to the end of the row. After the second half of the setup row is complete, you can take your waste yarn and slide it completely out of your knitting like magic. At this point, if you were working in rows, all of your stitches would be on one needle. So you could just turn your work over and begin working your knit one, purl one ribbing. I'm working in rounds, so I have things set up here on my flexible double pointed needles so that at this point I can just go ahead and start working in rounds. Here's my cast on edge. I just need to bring those cast on edges together, making sure that they're not wrapped around my knitting needles at all. And then I can go ahead and start working my knit one, purl one ribbing in the round here. And I'll just knit a few stitches so that you can see it actually is knit one, purl one ribbing. Work a couple stitches. One, purl one, knit one, and purl one. And I can just continue on around for the cuff of my sock in my knit one, purl one ribbing. Unlike some other cast-ons done in the round, you really don't get a sizable gap or jog when you work the provisional tubular cast-on in the round. To finish things off, what I like to do is turn my cuff so that I can see the wrong side of my knitting, thread the yarn tail onto a yarn needle, and then I will use the yarn needle to pull the tail through the base of the first knit V. I'm going to go under both legs of that V and pull my tail through and tighten things up. And that pretty much eliminates any little gap or jog there at the cast on edge. And finally, I would go ahead and weave in this yarn tail down the edge of one of the knit columns on the wrong side. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do the provisional tubular cast on for 1x1 or knit one, purl one ribbing. If you'd like to try this method in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechilidog.com and look for my best worsted socks pattern. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!